My brother walked into my office on the day I was closing the biggest deal of my career, sat down across from me like he owned the place, and slid a piece of paper across my desk. "We think it's time you made us partners," he said. My mother was standing behind him, hands folded, wearing the same expression she used whenever she wanted something from me, but needed to pretend it was my idea. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at my brother. Then I smiled and said, "I'm going to need you to wait outside for about 20 minutes. He didn't know that my lawyer was already on his way up. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house that smelled like instant coffee and resentment. My father worked at the nickel mine until his back gave out, and after that, he mostly sat in the living room watching hockey and making pronouncements about how the world worked. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and spent the other four managing the family's social politics with the precision of someone who had never had anything else to do. My brother Callum, 2 years older, somehow 10 years more entitled, was the one who was going to go to business school. That was the plan, the family plan. Every birthday dinner, every Christmas, every Sunday roast, the conversation circled back to Callum's future, like a drain pulling everything toward it. I was just the one who was going to get married and be sensible. Nobody asked me what I wanted. I figured out early that the safest thing was to stop having visible wants and just work. I got a scholarship to Laurentian. I studied accounting, then transferred to the business program at Ryerson when I was 20. I lived in a basement apartment in Kensington Market with two other girls and a radiator that made sound like someone was repeatedly dropping a wrench inside it. I ate a lot of rice. I sent money home when I had it, which my mother accepted without comment, as if it were expected. Callum, meanwhile, spent 2 years at a college in Bury that offered a business diploma and a lot of opportunities to party. He dropped out after the first year. My parents refinanced to cover the tuition he hadn't finished. Nobody ever really talked about that. When I was 24, I got a job as a junior analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Toronto. I was the only woman in my department. I kept my head down. I learned faster than anyone around me, and I made sure only the people who needed to know that actually knew it. At 27, I left to start my own company. It wasn't glamorous at the beginning. It was me and a laptop in a co-working space on King West, doing financial consulting for small businesses that couldn't afford the Bay Street firms. I charged reasonable rates. I was reliable. I answered my phone. I showed up when I said I would. Within 18 months, I had 6 clients. Within 3 years, I had a small team and an actual office with windows that faced south. My family's reaction to all of this was largely silence, punctuated occasionally by my mother asking if I was seeing anyone, and my father saying things like, a steady paycheck is nothing to be ashamed of. Callum had by then cycled through 4 jobs in 5 years: a car dealership, a cell phone kiosk, a brief and disastrous attempt to flip houses with money he borrowed from our parents, and a consulting venture that I was never able to get a clear description of. He was charming, my brother. He could talk anyone into anything for about 6 months. I didn't see them often. I was busy. I told myself that was why. The company's name was Harwick Advisory Group. I named it after the street where my co-working space had been, partly out of sentiment and partly because it sounded solid. By the time I was 31, we had 12 full-time employees, 3 office locations: Toronto, Ottawa, and Calgary, and a client list that included 2 publicly traded companies and a regional hospital network. I had worked for that. Every piece of it. There were years where I paid myself last or barely at all. There were years where I lay awake at 3 in the morning running numbers in my head. There was a period in my late 20s where I missed every social event my friends invited me to for almost a year because I could not afford to lose a single billable hour. My parents came to Toronto exactly once during those years for my grandmother's 90th birthday. My mother walked through my apartment, paused at the window that overlooked the street, and said, "It's quite small, isn't it?" I had 2 bedrooms and a parking spot in Toronto. At 29. I didn't say any of that. Callum didn't come because he said he had a thing. I made peace with the distance, or I thought I did. I called on birthdays. I sent gifts at Christmas. I visited at Easter when I could. My mother would update me on the neighbors, on my cousin's children, on the price of groceries. My father would fall asleep in his chair and then deny it. Callum would show up partway through dinner, already fed, and sit at the table talking about whatever project he was currently excited about. None of them ever asked me a direct question about my company. Not one. My mother once asked, "Is it going all right, the business?" And when I said yes, she nodded and changed the subject to whether I was getting enough sleep. I told my therapist once that I thought they genuinely didn't understand what I'd built. She suggested that might not be entirely accurate. She was right. The first sign was a phone call from my mother in February, about 8 months before everything came about. She asked if I was hiring. I said we occasionally brought on junior analysts and she could have anyone send a CV to our HR email. She said she didn't mean junior. Callum has been doing a lot of thinking, she said, about where he wants to be in 5 years. He's very mature about it now, you know. He's grown up a lot. I said I was glad to hear it. He thinks he could really contribute to something like what you've built. He has ideas. I said I'd be happy to have coffee with him if he wanted to talk through his ideas. There was a pause. He was thinking something more formal than that. I changed the subject. I sent Callum a text that evening saying the coffee offer stood whenever he wanted. He never replied. The second sign was in April. My father called, which was unusual enough that I picked up on the first ring. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said, "and we feel that family should support family, especially when one of them has done well." I asked him what he meant. "Callum needs a real opportunity, not charity, something with his name attached to it, something he can build." I said very carefully that my company wasn't something I could give a piece of to someone who hadn't been part of building it. "He's your brother," my father said as if that were an answer. I said I understood that. I said it didn't change what I told him. He said, "I hope you won't regret this." And then he said he had to go watch the game, and that was the end of the conversation. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that. The thing about being the person in a family who succeeds is that everyone treats your success as a communal resource right up until it costs them something to do so. I had spent my entire adult life sending money home when they needed it: the car repair in 2019, the roof in 2021, the medical bills when my father's hip needed replacing, and the wait time on OH hype was too long. I didn't keep a tally. I didn't want to. But I was aware, in a way I tried not to examine too closely, that I had never once been thanked in a way that cost them anything. I had a partner at Harwick by then, not a romantic partner, a business partner. Her name was Sylvie, and she had come on board 2 years earlier when I brought her in to run our Ottawa operations. She was meticulous, funny in a dry way that I appreciated, and she had the kind of ethical clarity that made me trust her with things I wouldn't trust most people with. She knew my family situation. She knew more than most people did. "You know this is going to get worse," she told me over the phone after I told her about my father's call. "They're not asking anymore. They're testing how you respond." I said I hoped she was wrong. She said not unkindly, "Zoe, I'm really wrong about this kind of thing. Her using my name like that, just Joe, which was what my close friends called me, short for my full name Zozia, which is Polish, and which most people in Ontario mispronounced anyway, reminded me why I'd made her a partner." She saw me clearly. My family never had. The call came on a Tuesday in October, which is when I was 3 days away from signing a contract with a company called Norgate Capital that would have been, at that point, the largest client in Harwick's history. The deal had taken 14 months to negotiate. I had personally led every meeting. I had restructured our service model twice to accommodate Norgate requirements. The signing was scheduled for Friday at 2 o'clock in our Toronto boardroom. My mother called Monday night and said she and my father and Callum would be in Toronto on Wednesday and wanted to have dinner. I said Wednesday was difficult. She said it was important. I said I could do lunch on Thursday. She said they would prefer to come to my office. That should have told me something. They arrived at 11 on Wednesday morning. I was in the middle of a prep call for the Norgate signing. My assistant came to the door of my office, and her expression was the expression she used when something was happening that she didn't know how to categorize. She said, "Your family is here, all three of them." I wrapped up the call. I asked her to put them in the small meeting room and bring them coffee. When I walked in, my father was standing at the window looking at the skyline. My mother was sitting with her hands in her lap. Callum was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, and he was wearing a suit. I had never seen my brother in a suit before in my life. It was slightly too large in the shoulders. There was a folder on the table. I sat down. I said, "It's good to see you. What's going on?" Callum pushed the folder toward me. Inside was a document several pages with what looked like legal formatting. I read the first page. Then I read it again. It was a proposal. They were calling it a family partnership restructure. The document outlined a plan in which Callum would take on the title of managing partner at Harwick Advisory Group. My parents would receive a 15% stake in the company in recognition of, and I am quoting this directly, the foundational family support that made Zosia's success possible. And Callum's compensation would be set at a level that put him above every senior analyst currently on my staff. In exchange, they were offering, according to the document, goodwill and family continuity. I set the folder down. I looked at my brother, who drafted this. He said he'd worked on it with a friend who knew about business. I said, "The friend who knows about business should know that you cannot compel a private company owner to restructure their equity through a family proposal document with no legal standing." My mother said, "Zosia, we're not compelling anyone. We're asking." I said, "You brought a document." My father said, "We wanted to be professional about it." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I'm going to need to think about this." And I stood up and I asked my assistant to bring more coffee, and I excused myself and went into the hallway and called Sylvie. "They're here," I said. They brought a document. There was a brief silence. Then Sylvie said, "Okay, call Marcus." Marcus was our corporate lawyer. "Tell him to come in today. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and do not let them leave thinking this is a conversation that's still open." I said, "My parents are in there." She said, "I know. Do it anyway." Marcus arrived at 1:30. In the meantime, I had lunch brought in, sandwiches from the place on Adelaide that I always ordered from for client meetings. I sat with my family and we ate, and my mother talked about the drive down and the traffic on the 400, and my father asked about the office square footage. Callum was on his phone. When Marcus arrived, I introduced him as our legal counsel, and I said we were going to have a conversation together. My brother's face did something complicated. Marcus had a very specific way of speaking in these situations. Calm, precise, with no visible emotion. He explained, methodically, that the proposal as written had no legal mechanism, that Harwick Advisory Group was incorporated as a private corporation under the Canada Business Corporations Act, that the existing shareholder agreement did not provide for the type of equity transfer described in the document, that foundational family support was not a recognized category of contribution under corporate law, that a managing partner designation carried fiduciary obligations that required at minimum relevant qualifications and a proper appointment process. My mother said, "We're not talking about the law, we're talking about family." Marcus said politely, "Mrs. Budley, Kaminchka, your daughter has asked me here because any conversation about restructuring her company is also a conversation about the law." My father stood up. He had the particular way of standing up that I remembered from childhood, when he wanted the room to register that he was serious. "Sozia," he said, "you built this on the back of this family. We sacrificed. Your mother and I sacrificed. And now you sit here in this office with your lawyer and you treat us like strangers." I said, "Dad, I sent you $42,000 over the last 6 years. I never asked for anything back. I never asked for anything from any of you." He said, "That's not what we're talking about." I said, "I know. That's actually my point." There was a silence. Then Callum said, "If you won't work with us, we'll go to Nougat ourselves. We know about the deal. We'll tell them you're not the right person to be managing their account." I looked at my brother. I said, Callum, do you know who owns the building that Norgate Capital operates out of in Toronto? He looked at me. I reached across the table and picked up my phone and dialed a number. I put it on speaker and set it on the table between us. It rang twice. A man's voice answered. Harwick, good timing. I was just about to call you. I said, Gordon, I have you on speaker. I'm in a meeting with some family members who've expressed an interest in reaching out to Norgate on their own initiative. I wanted to make sure you heard it from me directly. Gordon Zabo had been a client of mine for 4 years. He was a real estate developer who, among other things, owned significant commercial property in the downtown core, including the tower where Norgate's Toronto offices were located. He had referred Norgate to me personally. He said, Is that right? It was not a question. I said, They've also suggested they may raise concerns about my management of Norgate's account. Gordon said, Well, I'd be happy to speak to anyone at Norgate who has concerns about Harwick Advisory, since I am the one who vouched for you. And I'd be very interested to know who these family members are so I can make sure I never do business with them. I said, Thank you, Gordon. I'll follow up with you tomorrow. I ended the call. The room was very quiet. My mother said in a voice that had lost about half its volume, You didn't have to do that. I said, You didn't have to bring a lawyer's draft about restructuring my company. They left about 20 minutes later. My father didn't say goodbye. My mother hugged me at the door, which surprised me, and she said, I hope you know what you're doing. And I didn't know if she meant the company or the family or both. Callum walked past me without making eye contact. I stood at my office window and watched the street for a while. Sylvie called it for. I told her what happened. She said, How do you feel? I said, I didn't know yet. She said, That's honest. The Norgate signing happened Friday as scheduled. The contract was for an initial 3-year engagement worth more than anything I had negotiated before it. Norgate's CFO shook my hand and said, Gordon says you're the best in the business. He also said something happened this week that confirmed it, but he didn't say what. She smiled when she said it. I smiled when she said it. I smiled back and said, Just a family matter. Resolved now. In the months that followed, I didn't hear from my father. My mother called once, about 6 weeks later, to tell me Callum had started a new job, sales, at a firm in Sudbury. She said it was going well. She said he seemed happy. I said I was glad. She said, You know he doesn't mean to be the way he is. I said, Mom, I know. She said, We raised you both the same. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything honest I could have said that would have also been kind, and I had gotten old enough to know the difference. I hired 2 new analysts that fall. One of them was 23, just out of Dalhousie, sharp in a way that reminded me of myself at that age, except she had a confidence I had spent years having to build from scratch. I thought about what it would have meant to have people in my corner the way I was in hers. I thought about it, and then I let it go. There's a version of this story where I'm angry. Some days I still am. But what I feel most, when I sit in the office that I build and look out at the city I moved to with nothing, is something that doesn't have a clean name. Not pride exactly. Not relief. Something closer to the particular quiet that comes when you stop waiting for something that was never going to arrive and realize you got somewhere anyway. The document my brother brought is still in my files. I kept it, not as a reminder, not as a trophy, just because sometimes it's useful to have exact proof of the moment when you finally understood something you'd been avoiding understanding for a very long time. The self-made don't always start out knowing they're making themselves. Sometimes it takes someone handing you a piece of paper that tells you exactly what they think you're worth to realize how wrong they've been all along, and how little that has ever had to do with you.